Noticed it, but over the last few weeks here on the program, we have been doing a series of perspective pieces that have largely kicked off from the terrorist attacks, both in Paris and in San Bernardino, California, to try to put more perspectives. To try to put more perspective and background between a lot of what you're seeing. And always down at a much deeper level is what the power elite are up to. I call them the PTBs. Dr. Dennis Cuddy, my guest here, calls them the power elite. And they always are running things behind the scenes to achieve outcomes that, for the most part, people in Socialist Party D and Socialist Party R never seem to expect. And so if you want to find out what they're up to, well, I guess we should ask him. And that's what we're going to do here in the segment. If you look at what's going on right now with a lot of these movements on campus, the assault on free speech, a lot of it's nonsensical. For me, it reminds me of the stuff you and I saw in the 60s. It's a lot of hoopla over nothing or over something, but it's being handled in the wrong way. The Black Lives Matter movement is a perfect example of this one, because if they really cared about black lives, they'd care about the majority of black lives that were being taken by other blacks in certain parts of the country, and that would all be included. But in this case, black lives only matter in an area where they can create division and separation. And that seems to be what the goal is, because that creates the dialectical friction they need. So how do we know there's a power elite? I mean, how do you figure this in? And then what do they use to keep things moving to what their goals are?
Well, it goes far back, say 200 years ago. They started picking up what's become known, it really wasn't, the Hegelian dialectical process, where you have a thesis and then you have an opposition, antithesis, and you have all this friction and chaos, and then you wind up with a synthesis, which is their modus operandi usually. And you gave some perfect examples, like Alinsky said, you rub raw, in his Rules for Radicals, had an acknowledgement to Lucifer at the front. And he then in there said, we will rub raw the resentments to community and fan the latent hostilities, which is what Black Lives Matter as well. And recently where I am, there's a UNC Chapel Hill campus where they were going to have a session with the chancellor, and they would have all kinds of people cite their grievances and so forth. And a lot of blacks were there, and they actually resented the action of a specific group of blacks who basically took over the meeting saying, here are our demands. And so a lot of this is confrontational. And over the years, 400 or 500 years ago, they would pit Catholics against Protestants, and for even longer than that, Sunnis against Shia. And you would create friction wherever you can among ethnic groups or races or whatever. It doesn't matter. And that's where the order of chaos comes from, or order out of chaos. You have to create it. It's part of what has come to be known as chaos theory in some respects. But the point is, it seems to be a big mess. But if you look very carefully, I have one chapter in my book about planned incompetence. In other words, if you look at how they roll out Obamacare, you say, well, he has to be an idiot, a total incompetent. But as I tell people, nobody can be that stupid, right? And so what you look at is there's an organized plan behind what seems to be incompetence. Because if you come out incompetently with Obamacare and people go into a panic, then in effect they're asking for, oh my goodness, my premiums are going to go up. And then you step forward and say, don't worry, we will subsidize it. And everybody goes, the chaos, the worry, the frustration is over. The government will subsidize it.
Yeah.
And they don't bother to say, well, where's this subsidy coming from? And secondly, once the federal government subsidizes something, it basically controls it.
Because we knew, for example, that the ultimate goal when they created this thing was a single-payer healthcare system. We knew this. And so they couldn't come out and say, we're abolishing all insurance companies. What they did is, well, we'll create a structure where the insurance companies will fail just by the economics of the whole thing.
Right.
That will create the chaos, and then we'll be able to say the solution is a single-payer healthcare system. That's why all the promises we've been given have all turned out to be lies.
And I think, United Healthcare is the largest and is thinking about pulling out right now. So anyway, there's a plan, and it seems to be all messed up. It's sort of like Gamal Abdel Nasser said back in the 50s about Americans. Nasser had come to power with the aid of 100 Nazis subcontracted by the CIA in the 1950s. And he became very suspicious, and I put a quote in one of my books where he had said, you Americans don't make simple, stupid mistakes. I'm paraphrasing. You make complicated, stupid mistakes which makes us wonder what you're really up to. Yeah, and that's true. I mean, that's true here today, Obama, or whoever it is. The same thing is true with the political campaigns. Donald Trump, for example, seems to say a number of outlandish things, and you start to wonder, why is he doing that? So a lot of times when something doesn't make sense, I advise people, well, yeah, it may not seem to make sense, but if you look at it in terms of how it will further the power elite's goals, then it does start to make sense.
The thing that I always say, you can detect it, because typically if you're looking for, I call them agendas rolling along underneath the surface, you can't detect them directly most of the time. You have to detect them indirectly by piecing together what some of their adherents are saying. So I say, if what is logical, what seems to be logical, is not happening, then automatically there's another agenda rolling underneath the surface.
That's right. Over time, it would be like a parallel history or something like that, which is what's really going on. The press and media portrays things in a certain way, but then you have to remember that the power elite controls them. I mean, that was all part of Cecil Rhodes's plan, for example, with his Society of the Elect. He wanted to, as he called it, penetrate 4 areas: politics, economics, journalism, and education. And he linked up with J.P. Morgan, and they were originally going to buy 300 American newspapers to control them, but they figured if they could just get the, say, top 25 and buy them, then the other papers would get their information from those 25, and they'd be able to indirectly control news. And one particular example relevant to your question about how do we know the power elite exists, oftentimes people look at the New York Times as the newspaper of record over the years. So if you say, how does the power elite exist? Well, we've mentioned many times about how David Rockefeller, in his book in 2002 called Memoirs, frankly admitted, and I put the quotes over and over in my articles and books, where he says he's part of a secret cabal conspiring against the best interests of the United States in order to form a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. He said, if that's the charge, I stand guilty, I'm proud of it. Well, if the New York Times is the paper of record, and you look in the New York Times, you'll find a long, long review of that book by David Brooks, the supposed conservative on the Times staff. And nowhere in there does he even mention this quote. So what they do is they excise certain things they don't want you to know in interviews on television, whatever it is. They bring up things that they want to propagandize you with or condition you with or make you react in an emotional way, which fits in with Alinsky. It used to be Americans were very thoughtful. I remember back in the 50s and 60s, people would say, what do you think about something? And then around the 70s and 80s, they started saying, well, how do you feel about this? Because if they could switch your reaction to questions, problems, what you're viewing or hearing, to an emotional response, then you're more easily controlled. And that's why a lot of people from MTV went into commercial advertising in the 80s. Instead of saying, here's the 5 reasons to choose Pepsi over Coke, if you would say, just have happy people drinking Pepsi, you want to be happy, you'll drink Pepsi too. It's sort of an emotional reaction, sort of like Pavlov's dogs. We would be conditioned. And you can't do that. You really can't condition people unless you dumbed them down. So they had to dumb them down first, and then you had to undermine. The National Training Laboratories in the early 60s was part of the NEA, National Education Association. And they published a little book called Issues in Human Relations Training, where they actually talked about unfreezing, changing, and refreezing values. And they called it sensitivity training, and they used the word brainwashing. There's a form of brain. They actually admitted it. This is a form of brainwashing. And that's what we're going to be about. It was in education and television ads. Also, they would speed up things like Orwell's Agent O'Brien said to Winston in the book 1984, what if we quicken the tempo of human life? Because when you do that, when you quicken the tempo, then you can't be bothered with the past. It's, I can't do anything about it. It's a dead old white man, that sort of thing. And I've got enough problems now. I don't have time to worry about the future. You start having people think about immediate gratification, and you reduce them to sort of a primitivism. It's like Aldous Huxley said, a mindless state of subhumanity, which is where they're leading us, because then you become more animalistic. And animals simply have a reaction, fear, anger, food, whatever it is.
Okay, so if we were to apply that, could we not take some of the education issues? I mean, you were in the U.S. Department of Education. The education issues where we have moved education away from teaching children to critically think in terms of logic and reason, and we've moved them into collectivization. We've moved them to more emotional responses. And that's why you see silly things where originally tolerance was supposed to be the all holy thing which everybody had to abide by. And then once it became apparent that they were not very tolerant, the people espousing that, they said, well, I don't have to tolerate somebody else's intolerance, which of course you and I know is a big non sequitur. But you've got this kind of a thing now going in education. And that's what you're talking about. They've been moved away from being able to challenge things intellectually. And so people knee jerk when you talk about conspiracy theory. You go, boom, it's just dismissed right out of hand. No one ever looks at evidence.
Yeah, and there's a book by Christopher Simpson called The Science of Coercion, which deals with some of that, the period 1945 to 1960. But what you have is the behavioral psychologist, and this is why in my book, Conspiracy, the newest book I have, the last chapter is on this current reform movement called Common Core. And I begin there with the Illuminati. And, people are already conditioned to say, oh, Illuminati, that's, a lot of conspiracy nonsense. No, we give the names of the people, Pestalozzi and codenamed Alfred, and we started using his books and materials in 1806, and then Horace Mann, who's recognized as the father of American public education, he becomes a devotee of his. And then, jumping up a little further, and around the 1870s, you have Wilhelm Wundt with the first laboratory school over in Leipzig, and he was the grandson of another Illuminati member whose code name was Raphael. And his first American PhD was G. Stanley Hall, who mentored John Dewey, who's recognized today as the father of progressive education. And you mentioned about the collective and so on. That's what Dewey was all about.
We have to do a break here, but what you're saying is there really was a group called the Illuminati that came out of the 1700s, and they had a philosophy, and then that philosophy flowed forward into their ideological proteges, or those whom they mentored, and it rolled forward into the future. And finally, you wind up at John Dewey, father of modern progressive education, and Dewey set the stage and the framework for how progressives took over education today. We're talking to Dr. Dennis Cuddy right now. The book is Conspiracy. We'll be back. We're at SteelOnSteel.com. I'm John Leffler. The program is Steel on Steel.